Hello and welcome back to the CPO Strategy Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Sean Garlier-Parch, and today I'm lucky enough to be joined by Carsten Hansen. He's worked for the likes of United Nations, UNDP, and Cranfield School of Management. He'll be offering invaluable insights into where the space is today in 2023 and offering some guidance on how barriers can be broken down along the way too. Hope you enjoyed the episode.
Hello and welcome to the CPO Strategy Podcast.
Hello, Carsten, and welcome to the CPO Strategy. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for having me, Sean.
No, it's absolutely a pleasure. It's great to chat with you today, and I'd love to sort of start this off by sort of trying to find out a little bit about sort of what makes you tick in procurement, because I know that you've had such a sort of considerable career in the industry, and I'd love to find out sort of how it really began for you and where that story started. What made procurement the place for you?
Well, I think for most people, I didn't actually go straight into procurement. I sort of drifted into it by design, I have to say, but it wasn't my objective at university. I studied international relations, security studies, peace building, and I started my career with the United Nations as a junior professional officer. Basically, it's a secondment from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the United Nations. Before that, I had done peacekeeping. I have a military background, so I came from peacekeeping in Sarajevo in Bosnia during the 1990s. I was in Iraq for the UNICOM mission. And when I was seconded to Somalia because it was a conflict country, and the sort of peace building background that I had was the sort of entry point. Now, coming to Somalia and working with the UN, working on projects and development programs towards state building, etc. I quickly realized that I kind of felt unempowered. Everything that I needed to do, if I wanted to build something, if I wanted to buy something, if I wanted to bring some consultants on board, I needed to go to procurement. And I felt unempowered. I felt like, okay, I want to be these guys because they get things done. And I started taking courses, long distance, remote courses, piling them up. And ultimately, I ended up being elevated to the head of procurement and contracting for the UNDP operations in Somalia. And ended up spending 9 years in Somalia, building infrastructure projects, agricultural infrastructure, police academies, ministries, doing a whole lot of procurement, of course. But really working on implementing our programs, which had gone from what we call national implementation to direct implementation. There was a need for UNDP, in this case, to implement our programs themselves and directly, which meant that we were directly responsible for all the procurement activities and risk management on the ground. So my entry point really to procurement was about getting that empowerment, getting those tools in my hands, learning how to use them. And ultimately, I changed completely over to procurement and working in that space because that's where you get things done, frankly. And after that, I went to Lebanon as head of a supply chain division, then to New York as the global senior procurement advisor for the UNDP, and ending up doing a lot of risk management in procurement because that's really what I had learned in Somalia. It's the ultimate test for risk management. Everything you do has to be thought out to its furthest possible consequences because something will go wrong for sure. And that sort of risk management lens in procurement is something I took with me into my advisory positions and ended up leveraging that in running elections in Afghanistan, going to various countries around the world, doing procurement risk assessments from Iraq, Syria, the Pacific Islands, North Korea, where we also had operations. So really taking that procurement approach and that risk management lenses with me in everything I did. And then ultimately ended up as global head of procurement for UNDP, which I finished here 1st of April this year.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, certainly a lot of traveling, Carsten. It's a good job that you don't mind going around on the plane. You don't get sick. A lot of
Exactly.
air miles there. That's
Often you're on
fantastic.
that plane alone though, and you're the only one on the plane. That's when you know that where you're going is a little bit out of the way. So
Absolutely. And it's obviously such a diverse career. And I was going to say, from that, how have you felt like the world has really sort of changed in terms of sustainable procurement? Because I think maybe 10 years ago, maybe not even that, people would have had a very different viewpoint in sustainable procurement. And I think it's become sort of a bigger part of the discussion, and certainly at the top of people's agenda now. What would you say to that, and how would you sort of describe sort of the journey that sustainable procurement has been on, sort of to where it is today in 2023?
I mean, sustainable procurement has been around for a long time. There's been some fantastic champions within the space that has been doing a lot of great work. What's really happening, I think, is that it's gone from a nice to have or sort of a CSR kind of approach to something much more material. There's a growing and evolving framework of national legislation around sustainability, both in terms of reporting on your emissions, due diligence in your supply chains. And that materiality has now come into the equation and made it much more real. So much less a nice to have, but much more a financial materiality that kicks in, or real impact on your supply chain disruption. If you don't fulfill your due diligence obligations, you can risk having your goods impounded at the port of entry, and therefore you would have a supply chain disruption. So the notion of sustainability has become very real for business operations. I think that is the big change.
I was going to say, some people sort of have that, and they also face a little bit of a lack of knowledge there, and sometimes a little bit of reluctance to really embrace sustainability. But is that a key reason now that they sort of have to, in terms of legislation, that they don't really have a choice but to sort of embrace it now?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a key driver. The regulations are a key driver. And it's also about positioning themselves on the market now. Companies are realizing this is coming their way. It's going to become much more regulated, that space. So they want to get started on it. So I think the whole regulatory framework is important, is an important driver. There's also, of course, consumer sentiment. That's another driver, depending on your industry. But if you have a sort of very clear consumer-facing operation, and those sentiments are very real in your industry, then of course that's another key driver. Another one that have come up is talent retention. How do you attract and retain talent, particularly the younger generations who feel that this is an important part of their identity, working for a company that has a clear sustainability objective, sort of more purposeful approach to their workplace. And I think many companies, if they don't have that clearly articulated, it has potentially an impact on their talent or their ability to attract talent and ultimately retain them. And then also, finally, if I may, I think there's been so much interesting developments within digitalization, automation. So we now have new tools that makes it manageable and more easier to implement sustainability. I mean, we have blockchain, for instance. We can do isotope testing on fibers, so we can determine from which location that cotton or silk was originating. So we also have these new technology tools that allows us more effectively to monitor and manage sustainability efforts.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. And I just want to take you back to what you just mentioned there about talent. I find that really interesting that, that's now a key pillar for people when joining companies. They want to know that there's actually a strong sustainability sort of strategy in there. Are you sort of surprised at that's now sort of a key priority to individuals as well?
No, not at all. I have teenage children, and so they are very clear on what they expect as young consumers. I remember in 2022, I think it was, shopping at H&M with my teenage daughters. And there was these huge banners saying our cotton at H&M are completely sustainable. And I thought that was interesting that they made that such a very strong message to their consumers. But of course, they're targeting this particular segment of consumers in society. So it shows how this consumer sentiment is very real for many in the industries.
I think that's really powerful, isn't it, to try and get into the younger generation and sort of get them to carry it forward. Because obviously there's some individuals potentially that are, maybe the older generation that are very set in their ways, and they know how they've always done it. They don't want to change from that. But getting into the younger generation and sort of start from the ground up, that can only be a good thing, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. But I don't think we should underestimate the older generation, if you wish.
Yeah.
I think they're very much on the ball as well and really driving the push as well. They're definitely seeing the need for it. So I think it's really all around.
Fantastic. And I was going to say about sort of the global challenges that we've all sort of experienced over the past few years. Where do you think that has pushed sustainable procurement? Because I know that obviously the industry has been fighting fires, hasn't it, over the past sort of, I guess, 2 or 3 years, particularly. Just think about the COVID pandemic, and you think about inflation issues and the war in Ukraine and the like. Do you think that sustainability has sort of been parked a little bit, or do you still think it's at the fore over the past sort of 2 or 3 years? And then obviously looking at 2023 now, where do you think sustainability sits?
Well, I think the pandemic was an outlier. It was really an alignment of the planets from a procurement perspective. We, in my former team, we were tasked to deliver PPM and medical equipment to support governments that were not able to deliver that during the global stockout. And I mean, this is just a shout out to my former team, but also to any procurement practitioner involved in PPE procurement during that pandemic. This was an alignment of planets in a scale that we've never seen before. There were stories of suitcases with cash changing hands on the tarmacs of airports and flights being redirected, etc. So this was a very unique supply chain situation globally. And I think under those circumstances, yes, we weren't thinking about emissions. This was about getting things on a plane, flying it there. There was no time to do sea shipment versus air shipment calculations on lowering your footprint. It was about getting the PPE out to the people, or the vaccinations out to the people where and when it was needed. Also, when the boat is sinking, nobody is really concerned about who made it or where the life vest was manufactured, if you wish, right? So there was a lot of, unfortunately, additional exposure to human trafficking, forced labor scenarios in supply chains. Also because many of the regulations that were in place to go and do site visits became ineffective because you were not allowed to go to the sites. Even the regulators were not allowed to go to the sites. And we saw particularly in Asia that many of the migrant workers, the informal workers, became very vulnerable because many of them were laid off. And that sort of changed the dynamics between the most vulnerable workers and the employers, really making them much more vulnerable to abuse and so on. So I think there was a refocus once after the pandemic on saying, okay, this really happened, and we were very much exposed in this environment. And now with the net zero commitments from COP26 and now 27 last year, I think it's going to build up new momentum. We have to deliver against the national targets on net zero. And you see this evolving frameworks of due diligence in supply chains evolving at the national levels. The latest one, I believe, is in Germany that came out in January. We are expecting the EU directive on human rights. And these frameworks have real implications for how we do procurement and run our supply chains. And I think that momentum is now only getting stronger.
What do you think? So moving on about sort of sustainability and sort of what people fear the most. What do you think that procurement professionals are most worried about at this moment in time? What do you think maybe sort of stops them from moving to the next step in sustainability, and that they're really sort of guarding against?
Look, I think implementing sustainability in any organization is complex and multidimensional. There has been a lot of focus initially on policy and sort of the regulatory framework. And that is, of course, often the starting point in any organization. And when and how can you apply sustainability? But the real challenge is how do you implement it? How do you integrate it into business processes? How do you manage the additional workload, the expertise required, and so on? So, as the former head of global procurement for my previous organization, I was surprised how complex and how difficult it was. I had the clearest mandate on the planet working with the UN. We had 600 plus buyers in 174 countries around the world, all committed to the SDG 12.7 agenda. So why was it so difficult? So I wrote a piece called Waking the Trillion Dollar Giant, which is really an analysis of what are the barriers and opportunities when implementing sustainability. And quickly realized, of course, well, policy and regulations is an important part of it, but there's a whole organizational change process which needs to be managed. You need to pitch, if you wish, the sustainability agenda in different ways, in different languages, to different stakeholders. So when you talk to your CFO, you need to explain, what are the cost implications? When can you break even? What is the business case around sustainability? When you speak to the CEO, you need to position that in a different way. How are you positioning the company overall? When you speak to the requisitioners, you need to get them on board in saying, look, there's different ways, there's alternatives here, you can think differently about what you're requiring or how you use it. And then you need to pitch it to your own practitioners because they're already overworked as it is, and sustainability is a massive undertaking for them. So they need to understand what is the value. They need to have this reflected in their personal performance appraisals so that this is aligned with their expectations and your expectations to them. And then at the end, of course, you need to engage with your suppliers. You're not doing this in isolation. This is an entire transition of the global economy. So you need to work closely with your suppliers, making sure that their maturity within this space matches with your expectations and so on, and work hand in hand to meet that objective collectively. So I guess to answer your question, I think is what do we fear the most as procurement people? I think it's the sort of unrealistic expectation that this is procurement in isolation who can just implement sustainability. This is an organization-wide undertaking. It's a change of mindset, not only in the organization, but with the entire infrastructure ecosystem of your organization, including the suppliers.
Lovely, thank you for that. What about the notion of sustainability fatigue? I've heard a little bit about that, but I was keen to gather your thoughts about what you think it really means, and sort of how can it be best sort of overcome, I guess, and how people can sort of put that to one side and really sort of encourage people to follow through with what they say, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Look, I think it needs to be made tangible. There's a lot of talk, high level, a lot of noise, if you wish, around sustainability. And in order for procurement practitioners to really pick it up, it needs to be made tangible. It needs to be linked to KPIs, performance metrics. It needs to be something achievable. I think many procurement practitioners and managers feel that it's also moving goalposts, right? It's like there's something every day and things are changing. And that makes it very difficult to work with. And maybe sometimes you feel you're not able to achieve and live up to the expectations because the expectations are not clearly articulated in metrics. So make it real, make it tangible, put it into metrics, resource your people to achieve it, invest in the training and the awareness around sustainability so that it can be clearly defined in the context of people's work. And then I think you can overcome that. And then stop using that PowerPoint slide or that picture with the little green thing growing from the money. People are tired of that. They want to see something different.
It's a stock photo, isn't it? Yeah. I guess speaking generally now about procurement today, sustainable procurement. Where are we today, and how far along is that journey ahead in sustainable procurement? Because it is a journey, and there's a lot that's sort of gone on before where we are today. But I think progress has been made. But where along on that scale are we? And I guess what do the next few years hold for sustainable procurement, in your opinion?
So my hope and expectation is that in 10 years from now, we won't be talking about sustainable procurement because sustainability will be so integrated and standardized and just be part of procurement as we know it. And so you won't be differentiating between procurement and sustainable procurement. It'll be one of the same thing, simply because the regulatory framework, the mindset around procurement will have aligned. So this will just be considered regular standard procurement. And I think you can compare it a little bit to the accounting standards, or lack of same. Before the 1929 crash, there were no global accounting standards for how you report on the financial performance of your company. Similar today, we don't have the standardization in place yet for what are the global standards for sustainable procurement. And therefore, it can be a little bit of a confusing environment that we are navigating now. But once that standardization sets in, it will be much easier to navigate. And as I said, it will just become, in my view, part of doing regular procurement.
Fantastic, love that. I know, obviously, from your side now, you mentioned you just left at your role with the UN, and your new role now as executive director and founder of SourcingHaus Research and Consulting Group. So, what can you tell me about that, your mission statement, and sort of what that future for yourself looks like?
No, thank you. Yeah, so I left my role at the UN, where I was the global head of procurement services and also the co-chair of the Sustainable Procurement Working Group. So I stepped out of that last month and took the opportunity to launch this research and consulting company. And really our focus here is to exactly help companies navigate the noise, develop clear playbooks, clear strategies on how you implement sustainable procurement. Really talking about, at the practitioner level, how do you integrate sustainability into your business processes? How do you simplify it? How do you automate it so you can achieve scale and speed in the implementation? So that requires a clear roadmap, or a playbook, as we call it. We developed a playbook for this. Thematic areas where we have substance expertise, including emissions reduction, scope 3, and due diligence, and then taking that out to organizations and to help them implement organization-wide sustainability strategies that really reach tangible outputs. So really cutting through the noise, leveraging our practitioner experience, and taking that practitioner focus, making it real, which I think is so critical. I also wanted to say that I have, together with the Schulich School of Business here in Toronto, we've launched what we call the Sustainable Public Procurement Accelerator Lab. It's a bit long, so we just call it the SPP Lab. But really here, we've developed a research platform which will develop tools and methodologies which are research-based, which we can support procurement practitioners around the world in empowering them to implement the 12.7 of the SDG, which is about public procurement. And we really wanted to reach out to that procurement assistant sitting in a municipality in a faraway province in Indonesia, or Argentina, or Canada, and empower that individual to, with the tools, the methodologies, which are research-based, academically robust, software, which is open source on GitHub, which is cleaned up, that they can use and leverage without having to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in it, run the analysis, do the visualizations, use the metrics, and really empower them to go ahead and work on sustainability. So we really want to weaponize procurement practitioners around the world in the war against climate change. And that's what we're trying to achieve.
That sounds fantastic. Obviously, all the best with that. It certainly sounds that you're already quite busy, so I'm sure that won't stop either. But I'm sure that's how you like it, isn't it?
Absolutely. Thank
Lovely.
you. Lots of work to be done.
No, absolutely. And as a final feature, something that I'm newly introducing to the podcast, is I'm trying to get a bit of guidance as to, what that advice would be for you if you were starting your journey again right at the beginning. I'm talking probably fresh out of college, university. Would you be able to sort of give me an insight as to if you would do anything differently, or what any tips would be if you were starting your journey from scratch again?
Yes, I would have bought Apple stocks, Tesla stocks, and Bitcoin, and then I would be retired by now. That would be the advice I would give myself. Look, I doubt that I would have taken any advice from anyone when I just left university, and I think that's the way it should be. It's about going out there, taking risks, staying curious, trying new things, and really sort of building opportunities for yourselves by connecting dots. Fundamentally, I think things will emerge as you get into it. New opportunities will come from it. So just stay curious, keep pushing, and fundamentally, I think actually networking is the thing that has helped me the most. And I don't mean sort of networking in a broad and general terms, but really building relationships with people, professionals, as you move through your career, and leverage that, be a mutual support function for each other. That gives you the courage to do many new things, push agendas, and change mindsets. And I think that is just critical. And keep learning. I just did the Python course 2 years ago. I just turned 50, so I have to say that it was a challenge. But I needed to do it because I felt I didn't speak the language required to manage projects involving coding, etc. I will never become a programmer, but I needed to learn the language. And my point is just learn as much as you can, stay curious, keep evolving, because then you will frankly always be ready for the opportunity when it comes.
Lovely. Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us on the CPO Strategy Podcast today, Carsten.
Thank you for having me, Sean. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the CPO Strategy Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, make sure that you subscribe or like our social media pages so that you never miss an episode. I'll see you next time.